It's bad enough to catch a disease naturally, but to take a disease and turn it into a weapon, to enhance the disease, to make it more virulent or more contagious or resistant to known vaccines, that's particularly, it just kind of goes off the charts there. It's turning Mother Nature against us.
Weapons that destroy by spreading deadly diseases have a long and unhappy history. Billions of dollars have been spent by governments to create pathogens that can cause fatal illnesses. Even today, some countries are stockpiling just such a deadly arsenal. In a widely reported news conference, Syria has admitted as much. But perhaps more dangerous in the age of rapidly advanced technology, it's quite possible for individuals or groups to create biological mayhem.
12 countries are now battling an outbreak of a nasty strain of E.coli.
Wir verstehen sehr wohl die Konsequenzen, die das für die Landwirtschaft hat, aber wir haben es hier mit einer ernsten Infektion zu tun, wo wir einfach die Quelle bisher noch nicht eingrenzen können.
16 people have already died. Identifying the source of this E. coli contamination has become ever more urgent.
Some have even suggested that this super resistant strain of E. coli could have been engineered in a lab.
The World Health Organization calls the deliberate contamination of our food one of the major biological threats of the 21st century.
In the modern globalized economy, where food gets transported all over the world, there are a lot of opportunities for somebody to contaminate food with biological agents.
You know, I don't want to go into much detail, but there was an article that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences about sabotaging dairy products, milk, using botulinum toxin, and you can cause horrible damage with that. Many thousands of casualties.
Paul Jackson is a senior scientist at one of the United States' most important biological laboratories.
It is kind of frightening when you think of the multitude of different pathogens somebody could select, either a large population or a small targeted population. I mean, one can go through food, and there are cases in our not-so-distant past where people have done that.
Oregon authorities announced that the most serious biological attack in U.S. history was carried out not by foreign terrorists, but by the followers of a homegrown religious cult. Salad bars in 10 local restaurants were deliberately contaminated with salmonella. 751 people were poisoned and 45 hospitalized as disciples of Guru Rajneeshi sought to incapacitate voters and see their own candidates win the 1984 Wasco County election.
The salmonella incident occurred in the United States, but biological attacks could happen anywhere in the world. And so far, there has not been a coordinated global plan about how to deal with this. The word terrorism evokes images of airplanes smashing into office towers or bombs blowing up in markets. These remain real threats. So do attacks by chemicals, mustard gas, defoliants, or nerve agents. But there is something even more insidious: biological weapons.
That's the whole point of terrorism, is to put enormous psychological pressure on the audience that they're trying to reach. If we're talking about biological agents, I mean, they're unseen in many cases. You can't smell them. For that very reason, those kinds of weapons have a much more powerful psychological impact on target audiences. Even killing 5 people with a bioagent would be more scary than killing 200 people with a conventional explosive device.
There have been no confirmed cases of anthrax in Britain, but it's been a day of false alarms. The sorting office in Liverpool was closed down, and workers were forced to leave the stock exchange in London for a short time today. Police say people should stay calm but vigilant.
The latest victims in Florida, the scene of the first outbreak of anthrax. 5 new cases reported by the American media company overnight on the basis of blood tests carried out on every employee. The fact that this seems to be spreading 10 days after the first victim died there, confirmation of America's worst fears. Never mind the source then, the point is the panic. On Capitol Hill today, you could hear it loud and clear.
The threats from biological and chemical agents are real.
Following the 9/11 attack and the 2001 anthrax murders, the United States government poured billions of dollars into homeland security. Experts from around the world were attracted to well-funded scientific laboratories and think tanks. High on their list of threats to be investigated was the use of deadly pathogens as weapons, a long and ugly stain on the history of mankind.
Oh my gosh, biological warfare first reared its head when man started fighting man. You know, whether it was putting scorpions in a clay pot and tossing them at your enemy, or taking bodies of people who had died from the plague and tossing them over city walls in medieval times, poisoning water supplies. These are all ancient techniques in biological warfare, but it was only during the major wars of the last century where science started to be harnessed to conduct this type of warfare.
The real danger, the real threat is the beginning of the 20th century. You're moving into bombs, airplanes, and the brilliance of microbiology.
During the Sino-Japanese War, the Japanese government engaged in a massive biological weapons program. Between 1940 and 1943, Japan dropped hundreds of bombs infected with deadly germs on 11 Chinese cities. As many as 200,000 Chinese citizens perished.
They did initially the attacks on northern cities with plague, and people did die. And then later, in the early part of the 1940s, there were more aggressive attacks where they used anthrax, glanders, cholera, and other diseases.
Martin Furmansky is a United States pathologist with an interest in medical history. In 1998, a colleague sent him a package containing autopsies performed on Chinese victims years before.
And I opened it up, and there were page after page of these people murdered by biological weapons. It was the first time, and one of the few times, when I, looking at it, I could feel palpable evil in the room.
Dr. Furmansky discovered that some of the victims of Japanese bombing had survived. In 2002, he traveled to their villages.
They're called rotten leg villages for the simple reason that people who were there in the summer of 1942 got rotten legs. When you interview these people, you get a very similar story. A lot of people started getting boils on their bodies. A throbbing thing, it bursts, and then it oozes pus and blood and continues to be horribly painful and essentially never heals.
Eventually, Dr. Furmansky concluded that the villagers were suffering from glanders, a disease that attacked horses and which for decades had been all but eliminated. The Japanese had dropped bombs laden with this pathogen.
They spread cholera, they spread typhoid fever, they spread dysentery, they spread glanders, they spread anthrax, and they spread plague, essentially doing a biological scorched earth.
Perhaps even more horrific than the dropping of germ bombs were the experiments carried out by Unit 731, a laboratory in Manchuria.
Japanese sent out their secret police and rounded up troublemakers, and they would end up at Unit 731 as human guinea pigs. And they would inoculate them with diseases to see how long they would die, and they would tie them to stakes and drop bombs out of airplanes to see how well the bomb spread the disease. There's always an aspect when you're dealing with biological weapons and chemical weapons to some extent of, quote, extermination, the way you would exterminate vermin.
After the end of the war, Japanese scientists who worked at Unit 731 were granted amnesty by the United States in exchange for information on the biological weapons program.
The Japanese who did bad science and killed thousands of people doing it got off scot-free, and they ended up going back to the universities and became chairmen of departments and became captains of industry and led long, happy lives.
Successive Japanese governments have been extremely reluctant to take responsibility for atrocities committed during World War II.
All the major powers have dabbled in the germ warfare business. British scientists did their grim work here. In this research establishment, they stored a mere 50 kilograms of bacteriological agents, enough to kill every living thing on Earth.
The British experimented with typhoid, dysentery, and cholera, testing these pathogens on animals.
If you're using live agent tests, and this was done out in the ocean in many cases, what you would do is tie animals on cages on deck and disperse the agent and see how well it would affect the animals. And this was also done, for example, by the United Kingdom with sheep being tested with anthrax on Gruinard Island.
World War II did not bring an end to biological weapons. The Cold War heated up, providing another excuse to produce this deadly arsenal. Britain, France, and Canada, for example, embarked on a program experimenting with many kinds of diseases.
In that bottle, there would be enough to be a lethal dose, in other words, to kill something like 50,000 people. This bottle, on the other hand, contains a biological agent simulant. Now, if that were Francisella tularensis, which causes the disease tularemia, there could be enough in that bottle to infect every man, woman, and child in the world.
But it was the US biological weapons program that was the most dangerous. It was by far the largest and most ambitious.
Aggressor military leaders know this advantage. Chemical and biological agents cannot ordinarily be detected by the human sensory organs. You can't smell anything, taste anything wrong, but the effect can be deadly.
To further safeguard the experimenters, dangerous organisms are confined to safety cabinets. Using rubber gloves, which are sealed to the cabinets, scientists can handle deadly cultures and still be safe from infection.
With the Cold War, the United States begins a biological weapons program which is twinned with the nuclear program.
Pathogenicity of any potential agent is another important criteria. Of course, you're familiar with the pathogenicity of botulinus toxin, a suspension of which is here being tested by intraperitoneal injection of mice.
Many kinds of animals were used in US experiments: mice, rats, rabbits, guinea pigs, and most especially, monkeys.
A restraining box is used to hold the monkey in position to receive the measured aerosol dose. The animal is then passed through a series of airlocks and positioned in a sealed exposure chamber.
And then they started using monkeys. You get all the monkeys you want, but you still don't know at the end of the day whether it'll make a human sick, how much will make a human sick, how long the person will stay sick. And so you need to have human subjects in order to proof test the weapon.
We went through all kinds of rooms, ultraviolet lights. We changed our clothes into scrubs. Then we got on an elevator and went up to a catwalk. In each porthole, they had like a telephone booth. And that's where you went into. Then they'd close the door, and that's when you were hooked up to the tube. You couldn't smell it, you couldn't taste it, not a thing. A few seconds, it's over with.
Ken Jones was inhaling Q fever, a bacterial infection which can result in hepatitis and pneumonia. He is a religious pacifist, one of over 2,000 conscientious objectors who volunteered for Operation Whitecoat.
You are in Fort Detrick, where some 600 military and civilian scientists work together in research at the Army Biological Laboratories to protect this country against a biological attack, that is, a silent assault by an invisible cloud that carries disease organisms.
There was testing on humans, often done in a facility at Fort Detrick known as the 8-ball, which was an inhalation chamber where they could disperse aerosols and see, how much it takes to infect a human. But they were given immediate medical treatment, and to the best of my knowledge, there were no fatalities.
Whitecoat volunteers claim that the U.S. government assured them that all testing would be for defensive purposes only.
Making a vaccine to protect you, and making a hazmat suit to protect you, a gas mask to protect you. A lot of hospital procedures come from this operation.
What was happening at Fort Detrick was not only a defensive program, but also an offensive program. So it was research that could be used for either purpose.
There was controversy about the Whitecoat program. There was a lot of heat about the biological weapons program. There were ethical worries that do we really want to start a disease that might sweep the country? We just got rid of it.
I have decided that the United States of America will renounce the use of any form of deadly biological weapons that either kill or incapacitate.
President Nixon had decided that given the success of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in ending World War II, nuclear weapons were the supreme deterrent. The U.S. biological arsenal was deemed unnecessary. In 1969, the United States halted offensive biological research and eventually destroyed all stockpiles.
The idea was that the nation-state, the U.S. as a nation-state, didn't need it. It had nuclear weapons with which it could destroy large numbers of people quite nicely, thank you. And that, that possessing these things would just encourage other people to get them.
Whitehall, London, April the 10th, 1972. A place and a time of real significance for the future of the world and the people in it.
In 1972, 103 nations, including the United States and the Soviet Union, approved a convention prohibiting the production of biological weapons.
The treaty to which these nations have committed themselves binds them to stop making biological weapons and to destroy all existing stocks of this most disgusting means of mass slaughter.
The good thing about the Biological Weapons Convention is it established the norm, and it established a norm against what other people would do, what other states would do, and at least got that on the books.
But critics felt the convention was all but useless. It had no teeth.
It still has no inspection provisions, in large part because even before any country put ink on paper signing that treaty, there was the prevailing concept that it was impossible. It was unverifiable.
The Soviet Union actually used the convention to embark on the largest and most destructive biological weapons program in the history of the world.
And the Soviet signing of the Biological Weapons Convention, while at the same time embarking on a huge ramp-up of their biological weapons program, there are no words to describe just how heinous that type of a government policy is.
The Soviet Union always believed that there was no truth behind these conventions. And they believed that the Western side used the convention to gain certain advantages and to develop the biological weapons secretly, in spite of the convention. And they did, and they believed exactly the same. So they took advantage of the convention.
For 22 summers, Gennady Lepyushkin, a senior Soviet scientist and an army colonel, worked at Vozhrozhdenie Island in the Aral Sea. It was here, year after year, that the Soviet Union tested weapons loaded with the most deadly diseases imaginable.
На полигоне использовались рецептуры на основе САПа, мелоидоза, чумы, сибирской язвы, тулеремии, вэлла и ряда других. Использовались различные виды животных. Все зависело от того, какова цель эксперимента и какие ставятся задачи. В основном это были мелкие лабораторные животные, но использовались в работах и крупные животные. К мелким относятся мыши, крысы, морские свинки, кролики. Далее использовались также бараны, использовались лошади и приматы.
A Russian chemical weapons center at Chikany on the Volga River. It's suspected that chemical and biological weapons are still being developed at sites like this, so Western satellites have been watching for years.
The Soviet biological weapons program was roughly the same size as their nuclear weapons program. It was ultra secret, buried deeper than deep. So we're talking about roughly 50 facilities and upwards of 50,000 scientists and technicians. That's a lot of technical talent put toward the development of these types of weapons against plants, against animals, against people.
But I think many of us were very surprised at the enormity of the Soviet enterprise. Because I think until the end of the Cold War, we really didn't understand how big it was.
And they said, this is all for civilian purposes. We're going to make vaccines, organisms for pesticide use, and so on. And that's what, there's what they call a legend system that hid their real purpose. And they became by far the biggest biological warfare program that the world has ever seen, and probably the most sophisticated.
Sonia Ben-Ugram Gormley is a professor at George Mason University and an expert on biological weapons. She was born in Tunisia and studied in France.
They had several people from the KGB who would go into the Western countries, buy antibiotics that were available at the time, and these were used, sent back to the former Soviet Union, and used to develop pathogens that would be resistant to those antibiotics.
Some of the diseases which the Soviet scientists experimented with have long threatened mankind. Lithuanian-born Raymond Zilinskas is a former microbiologist and a director at the Monterey Institute of International Studies.
Nobody thought that anybody would be so irresponsible as to be working with smallpox virus. So that was, and that's a contagious, it spreads from person to person, and it's very deadly. In nature, it causes about 30% lethality. But what they weaponized was probably even stronger than that, maybe 50% or even higher. So that was horrible. And then the second one that was really awful was that they weaponized the Marburg virus, against which there is no vaccine, no treatment. There's about 80% lethality involved.
Ironically, it was Soviet citizens themselves, residents of the industrial city of Sverdlovsk, who discovered how deadly their nation's bioweapons were. In 1979, anthrax was accidentally released into the air. A wind blowing southward towards the city carried the pathogens. 60 people died. For 16 years, Sergei Popov worked as a scientist in Soviet laboratories, creating some of the most destructive weapons ever conceived by mankind. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, he immigrated to the United States.
I clearly understood that it was a biological weapon research. There was no way around it, because the system engaged people and did not let them go. There would be a record, the KGB record, wherever you go. The idea was to set up an automated research facility to synthesize different viruses. So it was a clear attempt to take advantage of new approaches in genetic engineering to design new varieties of infectious agents.
When these agents are used, people who get infected develop the symptoms of one disease. And when the physicians try to start treating that person for that disease, the treatment triggers the other agent, which eventually kills the person.
As horrific as this program was, unlike in the United States, Soviet scientists did not test the diseases on human beings, but they did use animals extensively.
A typical experiment is that many guinea pigs lose control of their lower body, so they do not control their rear limbs, and that resulted in paralysis and death. The experiments in monkeys clearly demonstrated that the biological weapons were very powerful. For some of these agents, there would be no protection. It would be complete collapse of the social life, of the society overall, of the economic life.
They developed aerosols that allowed to spread the bacteria or the virus via the air, make it airborne, and therefore increase the number of people that get infected.
The effects of a contagious biological attack could spread around the world, literally within a matter of days.
With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the new Russian state simply couldn't afford to support a program that cost the country billions of dollars. Bioweapons research and production were shut down.
Ultimately, it turned out to be a waste of effort and money, complete waste of effort and money.
Sergei Popov was one of thousands of Russian scientists who suddenly found themselves without a paycheck.
We were obscure people who never established our career, in communication with academic researchers. So it was very difficult to present ourselves, as scientists, and nobody would hire us based on our accomplishments in the biological weapon research. So it was a kind of trap without the clear way out.
Most of the thousands of scientists involved in the bioweapons program remained in Russia and tried to adapt to the new society. Dr. Popov managed to immigrate. He is currently a researcher in biotechnology at George Mason University. With the dismantling of the Soviet program, it was hoped that biological weapons would become obsolete. This was not the case. For years, Iraq had been secretly stockpiling a deadly arsenal, weapons they had produced themselves.
They had developed two really serious systems. One was based on bombs, 400-pound bombs that had three different kinds of warheads. One was anthrax, the second was botulinum toxin, and the third one was on something called aflatoxin. So those were ready to go. They were loaded. They had about 200 of those. And then they had 25 Scud missiles with the same kind of warheads, and they were ready to go too.
Well, they centered in on some of the things that were considered the classic agents in the major Western and Soviet program, like anthrax, like Clostridium botulinum. But then they also did some unusual things. Why would one turn a disease that causes liver cancer into a weapon? The results would have been shocking.
The Gulf War was over so quickly, the Iraqis did not have a chance to use their deadly arsenal.
The United States was pretty clear in articulating that all response options would be considered if Saddam used chemical or other weapons. And I think that caused some hesitation on his part.
After the Gulf War ended, Iraq's bioweapons program remained hidden until in 1995, United Nations inspectors finally uncovered it.
The inspectors didn't let them get away with it. If they had just thrown in the towel, it's very troublesome to think about how that would have changed the course of history in the Middle East, because Iraq would have retained a super secret and potentially very potent category of weapons.
Iraq's program illustrated vividly that it is conceivable that nations of all sizes could get their hands on bioweapons. Secretive countries such as North Korea are suspects, and Syria has actually admitted to stockpiling weapons of mass destruction, including biologicals.
I think there are some states out there that are still in this nasty business. So if you really want a knockout weapon, why not go for the one that's comparatively a lot cheaper, easier to develop technologically, than the one they're not looking for? So yeah, I'm worried.
Russia and the United States both insist that they are not presently engaged in the research or production of offensive biological weapons. Questions remain, however.
I believe that the United States are not a threat. The same is the United Kingdom. But we have very little information about Russian facilities. Still, we have at least 3 facilities in Russia engaged in the biological weapon research. Nobody ever defected from those facilities, and nobody was allowed to visit them. So they remain black boxes.
At present, the concern is not so much about nation-states using bioweapons as individuals, especially those with scientific knowledge. Seth Karras is a professor at the National Defense University in Washington. He has written extensively on bioterrorism and biocrimes.
But one of the things that surprised me when I started digging into this subject was the number of people who used biological agents of one kind or another for criminal purposes. It's not uncommon today to see people trying to get hold of toxins to use as instruments of murder.
In 1983, Arnfinn Nesset, a Norwegian nurse and nursing home manager, was convicted of killing 22 patients by injecting them with Curacit, a muscle-relaxing drug used by the home's medical staff. In prison, he admitted to murdering many more people. In the mid-1960s, Mitsuru Suzuki, a Japanese physician and bacteriologist, handed out sponge cakes filled with salmonella and dysentery bacteria to his colleagues. He was eventually linked to an outbreak of typhoid fever and dysentery that sickened 200 people and killed 4. Even more dangerous than vengeful individuals are groups bent on destruction.
Four Georgia men have been charged with conspiring to possess a destructive device. One of the accused said, "There is no way for us as militiamen to save this country, to save Georgia, without doing something highly illegal."
This wasn't just talk. They had taken real steps toward carrying out their plans.
The alleged plot involved explosives and a deadly biological toxin known as ricin.
You'd never think a little town like this, a little small town, to have something like that going on around it. Anything can happen.
Bioterrorism is a real concern. There are certain groups that are motivated And some of those groups that are motivated might have the capabilities, and at some point there's probably going to be some, at some point we are going to have a bioterrorist attack that could be potentially serious.
According to Al Jazeera and many other reliable news sources, Al-Qaeda had progressed much further towards developing biological weapons before 9/11 than the world had realized. While there has not been a biological attack by this group so far, it remains a real concern. U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, in December 2011, warned that there is evidence that Al-Qaeda in Yemen is hard at work developing weapons of mass destruction, in particular, biological pathogens.
Often called the brains behind Osama bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahri is now likely to assume the leadership of the diffuse organization that is Al-Qaeda. Filmed together by Al Jazeera in the mountains along the Afghan-Pakistan border, analyst describes Zawahri as bin Laden's closest mentor. This was in 2003, 2 years after 9/11.
The concern about Al-Qaeda comes primarily from the fact that it is one of the few terrorist groups that A, has been interested in causing mass casualties, and B, has explicitly expressed interest and in fact has tried to put together a biological weapons program. The fact that Zawahiri is still there has to be concerning.
Paradoxically, the danger of bioterrorism has increased with the revolution in the sciences that are prolonging and enhancing human life. As cures for cancer and other diseases are found, the number of trained people who could use their knowledge for nefarious purposes has also grown.
Well, the big change has been that biotechnology has spread throughout the world. And that means that all the equipment and supplies related to civilian, peacefully directed biotechnology is out there all over the place. And that means that theoretically everybody who's doing civilian biotechnology can do military biotechnology. A fermenter does not know that it's fermenting Bacillus thuringiensis to become a biopesticide, or Bacillus anthracis to become a biological part of the biological weapon system. And that's compounded by the internet having become the world's shopping center.
The number of people who know how to use the tools of biology and could conceivably do harm has grown steadily, so that millions of people are in that category now.
If I wanted to equip a laboratory that would be potentially capable of producing sort of important quantities of biological agent, I could buy that for not a whole lot of money on the internet. The reality is you could do that almost anywhere in the world today. Al-Qaeda was buying its equipment in Pakistan and had no trouble equipping a laboratory in Afghanistan that way. The kinds of fermenters or laboratory equipment that you would need, you can buy pretty much anywhere.
There are producers of botulinum toxin, and you can buy that over the internet. Most of those are in Asia, and particularly in mainland China. On the internet, they say, oh, we can provide any quantities you need. I mean, that's something completely new, that you can buy the most toxic substance in the world over the internet. And then the question is, what about what we call the lone operators? The people now that are setting up molecular biology laboratories in their homes, in their garages, in their cellars, or whatever, and they're doing it for the fun of it. Are they going to be able to create a pathogen? And would one of them be crazy enough to want to do that? Yeah, I would worry about that.
Maybe one of the most troublesome aspects of the life science revolution is that the information emerging is available to everyone, no matter what their motivation.
Most of the science that you need to create a biological weapon is obtainable through open scientific literature that needs to exist in order to improve the world's health.
Since the 1990s, numerous biologists got behind the idea that all the biological literature should be online. So your university undergraduate anywhere in Europe has access to stuff behind paywalls via their digital libraries and has access on an equal basis as the 16-year-old kid from Bangalore.
Nothing illustrates the dilemma of readily available research more than the bird flu controversy. In September 2011, a team of Dutch and US scientists announced that they had engineered a strain of airborne H5N1 that could spread among mammals and possibly humans. It caused a worldwide uproar.
It's a real-life tale that reads like science fiction. A Dutch scientist using US government funding creates a deadly synthetic virus, a super lethal bird flu.
This is a model of an influenza virus, of which bird flu is one. Inside are genes that change, and it's within this hub that mutations happen. Previously, scientists thought it would take many mutations for bird flu to become airborne. Now we know it only takes 5.
In February 2012, the World Health Organization convened a meeting of experts who concluded that the H5N1 research should not only continue, but also be published. A tsunami of controversy descended.
In order to defend ourselves against a possible mutation, we need to do that kind of research. But the question is still, is it worth the risk? And that's, some people say, you know, on the cost-benefit on that, the costs are too high because it could be released out of the laboratory and then it would really be hell. And other ones are saying, no, you know, it's being done under the highest security conditions, and we're learning a lot from it, so we are better prepared. So, make your choice.
But given that Mother Nature is the ultimate bioterrorist, I think we have to push forward on the research. I don't think we have an awful lot of option.
A small group of scientists, so-called community, essentially created a weapon of mass destruction. And they did so to make a political point that more public health resources and attention should be focused on this particular problem.
The risk of publishing it wasn't just that some malefactor is going to make this and let it loose, you know, because he thinks he'll bring Armageddon, but that it will now spread to dozens of laboratories who will make it and study it. You know, the risk is in a small number of years, you know, this will get out.
The larger scientific community, to put it mildly, let the rest of humanity down.
The bird flu controversy highlights a difficult question facing the world's population. What can we do to stop terrorists, individuals, or groups from creating and using biological weapons? So far, the global community has not come up with a planned response to this threat. The US government has spent billions of dollars developing vaccines against pathogens such as anthrax. But many critics believe that biotechnology is changing so rapidly that these will be rendered useless.
We don't have a medical countermeasure for every possible disease, especially with viruses. So if a terrorist adopts one of those kinds of pathogens, then we have problems. A second possibility that we worry about is genetic engineering of existing pathogens. If a terrorist group were to make their bug resistant to some of the more common antibiotics that we stockpile, it would create tremendous problems for us. It's not trivially simple to do, but it's also not rocket science.
I think expecting that there could be like effective worldwide control over all the components and all the materials and all the equipment that could be used to manufacture bioagents, I think is a fantasy. I just don't think that's possible, unfortunately.
Some effort is being made to put in place global safeguards. The manufacturers of synthetic DNA, for example, in the United States, Europe, and China have established guidelines regulating who would obtain this material. But these are not industry-wide, and they are voluntary. Another strategy is for scientists to report any erratic behavior by a colleague. The FBI, supported by President Obama, would like to say more about what goes on in life science laboratories. But United States scientists resist this. They believe they can police their labs themselves.
I'm firmly convinced that the regulations in this field are important, but they won't be sufficient unless people take very seriously the possibility of biological weapon attack by, say, individual scientist who has access to biological agents. So working with people, seeing people next to you is very important, and probably the only way to really to prevent something dangerous taking place.
Ironically, the best way to control biological terrorism may have to do with the weapons themselves.
If somebody infects themselves with a horrible disease, I mean, their death is going to be hideous. It's going to be prolonged and horrible and hideous. It's a lot more romantic to go out with a glorious bang than it is with a slow, painful whimper.
All of our rules and international conventions are designed by nations for nations. But because of internet, that has been a quantum shifter, because now we're dealing with individuals that can circumvent all national rules. You have a computer, sitting in every home. How can you control it all? So I think that's really the biggest arms control issue, at least in the chemical and biological field right now.
In the end, scientific ethics and basic human goodwill may be the only deterrent to the proliferation of biological terrorism, whether by countries, groups, or individuals.